We have now Professor Mariusz Wołos, Pedagogical University in Cracow, Poland, Polish-Soviet relationships during World War II, stereotypes versus reality.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Very happy to see you. Proszę bardzo.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for invitation in our conference. Ladies and gentlemen, the leaders of the Soviet Union in the interwar period reconciled themselves with the existence of independent Poland only seemingly. In fact, they treated that country as a barrier to the march of communism into Western Europe. In the talking of Soviet leaders, one can at most distinguish two tactics in their approach to Poland. The first one was the plan to subordinate Poland totally as a state ruled by communists led from Moscow. The instrument for achieving that goal was the Comintern, Communist International, and the Communist Party of Poland. Its leaders were trained in the Soviet Union, and the activities of the Communist Party of Poland were financed by the Soviets. The constant Soviet aspiration was to destabilize independent Poland from the inside, from the within. The activity of communists increased during breakthrough periods, during social conflict, and violent events such as Piłsudski's coup d'etat in May 1926. The communists tried to escalate tensions and to transform internal conflicts into a civil war. They wished to give extreme force a chance to take power in Poland, in other words, to install communists who could count on the support of the Red Army. There was also yet another tactic that should not be seen as competing with the previous one, but as its perfect complement. The unsuccessful attempt to seize Polish lands and destroy independent Poland in 1920 during Soviet-Polish War, and then the failure of the communist revolutions in Germany in 1923 caused a temporary reduction in Soviet aspirations. The realization of the goal set in the first tactic was postponed to an indefinite future, although it was not abandoned. Not the minimum goal was set for the reconstruction of Soviet Russia, then the Soviet Union, within the border of the former Russian Empire. It was for these reasons that there was not one but several communist parties in the Second Polish Republic, including the Communist Party of Western Belarus and Communist Party of Western Ukraine. This new tactic was already directed against the integrity of the independent Poland, even it's the communists from Western Belarus and Western Ukraine constituted autonomous parts of Communist Party of Poland. Anyway, the term Western Belarus and Western Ukraine were constantly and not accidentally used by Soviet leaders and referred to the eastern territories of independent Poland. Here are quite a few examples showing that Soviet leaders did not really recognize the borders of the Second Polish Republic. I will refer to just one of them, a very meaningful one. In the mid-1930s, on his way to Geneva for a League of Nations meeting, the head of Soviet diplomacy, Maxim Litvinov, told the American ambassador in Moscow, William Bullitt, that he was born in Białystok, which was on Polish territory. At Bullitt's words, "I didn't know you were Polish," Litvinov reacted violently. He firmly stated that he was not Polish and that the area around Białystok was not Poland and would soon return to Soviet Russia. These were prophetic words that found their expression in the dividing line of Central Europe, including Poland, into the zones of interest established in the secret protocol attached to the Hitler-Stalin Pact in August 1939. The attitude of Soviet leaders towards the Second Polish Republic is best reflected in the word of Molotov, who called independent Poland's clumsy bastard of the Versailles system. This is not an accurate translation of his word. He used the Russian term urodliwe dzieciще, which is better translated as a child, a terrible monster, przebrzydły bachor. People such as Stalin or Molotov were responsible for creating the optimal condition for Hitler's aggression against Poland, and thus shared responsibility for triggering the Second World War. The Soviet aggression against Poland and the Red Army entering the borders of the Second Polish Republic, 17 September 1939, marked the entry of the Soviet Union into World War II as Germany's ally. The Prime Minister in exile, General Władysław Sikorski, in 1939-1941, did not emphasize in Paris and London the enormous scale of Soviet repressions against Polish citizens in the territories occupied by the Red Army. At most, he just spoke about the actual state of war between Poland and the Soviet Union. And that should be considered a mistake. The persecution of Polish citizens by the Soviets was not known to the world opinion, even though it should have been. Neither of the following was revealed to the world: the deportation of Polish citizens deep into the Soviet Union, the execution carried out of the defenders of Grodno in September 1939, the shooting of General Józef Olszyna-Wilczyński immediately after being taken a prisoner, the murder of Polish landowners, and many other crimes. All those happened while the Soviet Union was Hitler's faithful ally with France and Great Britain waging war. If the Polish authorities published the crime in the 1939, 1941, it would be more difficult for Stalin and the communists around the world to lie about the Katyn massacre. Katyn was been and will always remain a symbol of Polish martyrdom in the Soviet Union during the Second World War. But Katyn is also a symbol of the attitude of Soviet leaders with Stalin and the forefront toward independent Poland and its elite. Today, historians know a lot more about Stalin's attitude to Poles. One should not forget about the Polish, or in fact anti-Polish operation of NKVD carried out in years 1937-38. As a result, more than 110,000 people, mostly Poles, were murdered. Stalin's negative, cynical, and criminal attitude towards Poles was a part of his political persona. The entry of the Soviet Union into the group of allies after the German aggression against Stalin's state was accepted by most Poles in the hope that in old weeks both occupiers and enemy of independent Poland. The outbreak of the German-Soviet war forced the settlement of relations between the government of General Sikorski and the Soviet Union, now as an ally in the fight against Germany. The process revealed the weakness of Sikorski's government not only against Stalin, but also against Churchill. Under British pressure, Sikorski agreed to remove all problematic points from the text of the agreement, including the issue of the Soviet recognition of independent Poland's pre-war eastern border. General Sikorski was so determined that to remove professional diplomats from negotiation with the Soviet ambassador in London, Ivan Maisky. The agreement was signed on July 1941. Based on it, Polish citizens from Soviet prisons and labor camp, Gulag system, were granted amnesty. This wording was very unfortunate because amnesty is given to criminals and not to people imprisoned in labor camps or prisons without a court sentence. In the judgment of the mentioned agreement, two reasons have been colliding. According to the first one, represented by critics of General Sikorski policy, Stalin was given the initiative to determine the future border of Poland, which a full approved from Churchill, former Minister of Foreign Affairs in the Polish government in exile, August Zaleski, removed by Sikorski from negotiation with the Soviets, even wrote about selling Poland's eastern border at the price of winning popularity among the British. The Piłsudski, former finance minister Ignacy Matuszewski, went ever further in his criticism of the Sikorski-Maisky or Sikorski-Stalin agreement. He pointed out the signing of such an agreement actually absolved the Soviet of all their crimes and persecution committed against Poles in the occupied territories in the years 1939-1941. Thus, the treaty was not only a renunciation of the eastern lands, but an actual surrender to Stalin, and the time when the latter was weak and was losing the war against Hitler. Supporters of General Sikorski's policy, however, emphasize other aspect of the agreement with Stalin, the possibility of forming a Polish army in the Soviet Union and the liberation of Poles from Soviet labor camps and prisons. In their opinion, prolonging negotiation could have ruined but the possibility of forming the army in the East, as well as the release of prisoners. Nevertheless, it is a fact that General Sikorski decided to have a demonstrative rapprochement with the Soviet Union. In December 1941, he traveled to Moscow to meet Stalin, thus expression, that he did not believe in the defeat of the Soviet Union in the war against Germany. A year later, in Detroit, he, General Sikorski, met with Polish communists and simultaneously attacked critics of his deal with Stalin, including Matuszewski, who lived in New York City at the time. Guided by Allied loyalty, the American administration supported the effort of General Sikorski in combating his political opponent like Matuszewski, thus supporting the communists as Stalin's supporters in the United States. It was only one on many of the paradox of World War II. Polish-Soviet relations began to deteriorate clearly in 1942. The principle was simple. The stronger the position of Soviet Union and Stalin in the war against Germany, the more brutal the attitude toward the Polish ally. The Soviet authorities hindered not only this release of Polish citizens from prisons and labor camps, but also the formation of the Polish army commanded by General Władysław Anders. In 1942, the army left the territory of the Soviet Union. There was also a process of so-called passporting or guaranteeing Soviet citizenship to former Polish citizens, especially Ukrainian and Belarusian. All this happened after the successful defense of Moscow. In 1942, it was increasingly clear that the Western allies, the Americans and the British, were handing the future of Poland over to Stalin. Polish-Soviet relations became more and more of a burden for Washington and London. These relations were also the weakest link in the anti-Hitler coalition. Polish affairs were increasingly moving into the orbit of the influence of the Soviet Union. It was evident even before the Tehran Conference. The process was not stopped by the disclosure of the Katyn massacre by the Germans. Katyn was very uncomfortable for the Americans and the British. Information about the crime was censored. Stalin used the disclosure of fact about the Katyn massacre to sever relations with the government of General Schakowsky. It was a smart move for him because after the German defeat at Stalingrad, his advantage increased not only on the front line, but also within the anti-Hitler coalition. After the death of General Schakowsky in the plane crash in Gibraltar in July 1943, Stanisław Mikołajczyk became prime minister. He had neither the experience nor preparation to conduct foreign policy. He did not know the Soviet Union and the mentality of people such as Stalin or Molotov. Contrary to the opinion of the commander-in-chief of the Polish army, General Kazimierz Sosnkowski, and many opposition groups, Mikołajczyk was not against the outbreak of the Warsaw uprising in August 1944. He hoped that the uprising would be a bargaining chip during his talk with Stalin in Moscow. It was a naive pre-assumption. For years, Stalin had at his disposal a Polish army commanded by renegade and communists. The Soviet dictator also prepared the nucleus of the Polish communist government in the form of the Union of Polish Patriots, which did not recognize the Polish government in exile. In July 1944, the Polish Committee of National Liberation approved in Lublin. It had been formed in Moscow and was in fact a communist government. The process of making Poland dependent of the Soviet Union had already been advanced. During the conference in Yalta in February 1945, Roosevelt and Churchill not only officially confirmed the consent to the Kherson Line and shifted the borders of future Poland to the west, but also gave Stalin all the preconditions for the Sovietization of Poland. Moscow was to decide what the future Polish government would look like, and it was Stalin who decided who would be a minister in the Polish government. In June 1945, the Provisional Government of National Unity was established, which was in fact controlled by communists. The legitimate Polish authorities in London were not even invited to the conference in San Francisco, where in April 1945 the United Nations was founded. Conclusions. The Second World War was a huge defeat for Poland. Per fact, it is best reflected in the title of the book by the Polish ambassador in the United States, Jan Ciechanowski, Defeat in Victory. We started at war as an independent state, and we ended it as a state dependent on one of the two aggressors. Thank you so much for your attention.